This is a scripted dialogue based on actual conversations I've had with the various conservative Christians on the topic of biblical prophecy. Many Christians regard fulfilled biblical prophecies as good proof for the truth of Christianity, whereas I think the prophecies are demonstrably phony. The Bethlehem Prophecy. So what prophecy impresses you?
Well, there are very specific prophecies that relate to the coming of Jesus.
Like he's going to be a suffering servant?
That's one of them.
But you see how that is not impressive to me. It's not specific. That's a general term that could be applied to many other people. I mean, almost any leader can be viewed as a suffering servant for his people.
Well, how about that he would be born in Bethlehem?
Okay, let's look at that prophecy. I say that that is a false prophecy, because that Messiah was supposed to be a military leader.
No.
No? The prophecy in Micah in the Old Testament says that he was supposed to deliver the Hebrews from the Assyrians. Jesus didn't have anything to do with the Assyrians.
No, he didn't. That all happened before Jesus.
Right, so Jesus can't be the Messiah that it talks about in Micah.
No, at the time of Isaiah and the Assyrians, the coming of the Messiah still lay in the future.
Right, so this cannot be a prediction of Jesus, because this Messiah was supposed to be a military leader, and Jesus was not a military leader.
Well, he is in the sense that at the end of time he's going to defeat all nations.
But it's not referring to the end of time. It's talking about the Assyrians back then. Micah's talking about this predicted Messiah in Micah's generation. A military leader. This is a Messiah with a sword, not Jesus with his peaceful words. So it cannot be referring to Jesus. And I conclude this is not a valid prophecy.
Well, the Bible says God sent the angel of the Lord who came and killed all these Assyrians, destroyed the Assyrian army.
But an angel of the Lord is not Jesus. He hadn't been born yet.
The point is that it's talking there about God. God delivered them.
Okay, God delivered them according to the story, but I don't see how this is a miraculous prediction of Jesus being born in Bethlehem. What I see is New Testament writers reaching back into the Old Testament and simply claiming a connection to this Messiah, even though Jesus does not fit the description as a military leader. So it's not a miraculous fulfillment of a prediction. It's just writers with a religious agenda dishonestly drawing connections. The Prophecy of Tyre. You know the prophecy of Tyre in the Old Testament?
Yeah.
To me, that is a false prophecy. Ezekiel predicts Tyre will be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and will cease to exist. But it's still there in the New Testament and is still there today, this very day.
But there was another city there and it was conquered and destroyed.
Yeah, the inland part of Tyre, Ushu. But Tyre proper was the island city. The island city. Ezekiel is referring to the island city. Quote, "Your borders are in the midst of the seas." That's an island. And he said it would be conquered and destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, who did conquer Ushu, the inland city, but he was never able to defeat the island city. So he failed. That's a false prophecy to me.
Well, I don't see that's...
Ezekiel said Nebuchadnezzar shall trample all your streets, but he didn't. He trampled the streets of the inland city, but not the fortified island, which was his real goal, to take the island city. It wasn't until years later that Alexander the Great took the island city.
Right, Alexander fulfilled that prophecy years later. A prophecy doesn't have to have all the details.
But these are not details. This is the very essence of this prophecy, that Nebuchadnezzar would destroy Tyre. There's no reference to Alexander taking the city years later. Also, the details are important. A prophecy without specificity loses its impressiveness. You know, if somebody predicts wars and rumors of wars, so what? There's always wars and rumors of wars. You gotta be specific. I'll give you an analogy. The way I interpret things compared to the way you interpret things. If someone predicts there's going to be a car accident next week on Elm Street between a blue car and a gray car, and it doesn't happen, I say that is a failed prophecy. But if a month later there is a car accident, but it's on Main Street, not Elm Street, and between a black car and a green car, the colors are wrong, you're going to say, aha, the prophecy has been fulfilled, miraculously fulfilled. But I'm going to say, no, it hasn't. Specifics matter. These are the games you play. You dismiss the details as unimportant and just pick out what you want. But correct details are important. They have to match. Otherwise, of the millions of things that happen, you can always draw some connection somewhere. You can always retrofit some element. That doesn't make it a divine, miraculous fulfillment. So you see why I'm not impressed with biblical prophecy?
Well, I'm not that familiar with the actual history of Tyre.
But regardless of the actual history of Tyre, the biblical narrative in itself contradicts itself. Ezekiel says Tyre will be destroyed. No one will be able to find it. But in the New Testament, it's still there. Ships do find it and unload cargo there.
I'm saying that that prophecy doesn't require that Tyre necessarily be completely destroyed.
I think it does, because in chapter 26, verse 20, it says, you will never be inhabited. Verse 21 says, you shall be no more. To me, that's complete obliteration. Let me give you my strongest argument here. Ezekiel could not have been referring to Alexander 240 years later after Nebuchadnezzar, because Ezekiel 12, 27 to 28 gives a time limit for his predictions. He says, the house of Israel is saying, the vision that he sees, Ezekiel, is for many days from now, and he prophesies of times far off. Therefore say to them, thus says the Lord God, none of my words will be postponed anymore, but the words which I speak will be done, says the Lord God.
None of my words will be postponed anymore.
Right. He doesn't say some of my predictions may not happen for a while. He says none of them will be postponed. But the Tyre prophecy was postponed 240 years until Alexander the Great came along.
Well, saying that something is certain, all that tells me is that it's certain, that it's going to be performed. It doesn't say, and there is no delay. It doesn't say when it's going to be done.
But he does. That's exactly what he does say. When. That it will not be postponed. And you have to assume certainly not postponed past the lifetime of the people Ezekiel is talking to.
I wouldn't assume that.
It won't be postponed, but it'll happen 240 years after you're dead.
Right.
But that's nonsense.
To your way of thinking of things, but it can be to God's way of thinking of things. 240 years is not a long time for God to wait.
Oh, I've heard this argument before, that the prophet was using God's broader concept of time. When Ezekiel said no more delays, you really think he meant in God's time? That makes his words to the people he's talking to meaningless. At the very least, very misleading. You might have a case if Ezekiel said, there will come a time when, but he didn't say that. He said in plain language that his predictions are not going to be delayed anymore. Normal human time, not God's time.
I don't honestly know the actual history of Tyre, so I'm not going to argue that point with you. I would say that the point is that God pronounced judgment on Tyre, and it was destroyed.
Like I said, a general prediction that you can retrofit into any point in history is not impressive. It's not valid prophecy. It's not miraculous. It's not evidence of the divine. And even when some details do match well, I don't find biblical prophecy impressive, because people can deliberately fulfill alleged prophecy. Like when Jesus rode in on a donkey. He probably did that on purpose to make that connection to the Old Testament scripture.
Yes, yes.
But that doesn't mean it was miraculously orchestrated by God. I mean, Joe Schmo could deliberately ride in on a donkey, and that wouldn't make him the Messiah.
I agree that Jesus was aware of that prophecy, but the main point here on Tyre is that Tyre was judged and Tyre was destroyed.
So you think it was a miraculous prophecy, even though Ezekiel was flat wrong about elements of his prediction? To me, it's like you predict the Knicks will win tomorrow and they don't, but they win next week, and you claim the main point is the Knicks will win. I think predictions without time limits are bogus. And Ezekiel, no offense, but to me, he's just a religious nut, spouting over-the-top nonsense. You will be destroyed, you will be desolate, God will do this, God will do that. Did God keep all humans and animals out of the country of Egypt for a 40-year period? No, that never happened. Ezekiel said that would happen, but that did not happen. To me, the Bible is full of religious extremists falsely claiming to speak for God. Criteria for valid prophecy. Note that this video, like most of my others, consists of a mixture of various Christians, not just one Christian. What's the most impressive prophecy to you? I don't find any impressive prophecies. I find just vague stuff.
What do you define as prophecy?
Oh, okay, good. Something that was predicted and miraculously, beyond all probability, came true. And wouldn't you agree that, for one, it has to be verified to be written before it happened? Two, it has to be verified that it did happen later on. Three, has to be something specific, not just some vague thing. Four, the time can't be open-ended, so you can say, well, this is going to happen. That's not impressive. And five, somebody deliberately fulfilling a prediction is not miraculous. So I think valid prophecy must satisfy those five qualifications.
And you would argue against prophecy for all religions, I assume, right?
Right, I don't think any religion can prophesy.
You don't think it's at all possible to predict the future?
Right. I mean, sure, you can make good guesses that come true, like a sports team is going to win, or you can make 100 predictions, and of course a few of them will come true, but that's very much within the realm of chance. What I mean is, you can't miraculously predict a specific future event that is beyond all chance. So which biblical prophecy impresses you as miraculous?
Well, lots come to mind, but to objectively impress you is not possible because you're a subjective being.
I don't get your point.
Okay, your being impressed is not a fair measuring stick because your being impressed can be different from anyone else being impressed. You have to acknowledge that you are a subjective human being.
No, I don't acknowledge that. I try my best to be objective about things. I mean, sure, my tastes in music or ice cream is subjective, but something like prophecy is different. I think my judgment here is objective.
Who sets the standard of what impresses you and what doesn't? Whether a prophecy qualifies as proven?
Just common sense standards. You can have objective standards, like the 5 criteria I mentioned, especially the specificity one. Something specific that is impossible to predict by natural means.
But if things like that do happen, you won't believe it because you're subjective.
Well, depending on what it is, yeah, I might claim it's just a coincidence.
So that means you're being subjective about it.
No, I'm trying to be objective. It's the biblical writers who are subjective. They're claiming that chance fulfillments or vague fulfillments are miraculous fulfillments.
Things like that have happened a lot, and you would call it just coincidence. Because you're subjective. There's nothing I could say to impress you.
But there is. There is. You can clearly show that the prediction was fulfilled under those 5 criteria I mentioned, which you agreed with.
All right, how about this? In Matthew, Jesus told his disciples several times, I'm going to die, and in 3 days I'm going to rise from the dead. And then it happened.
Well, no. That violates the verification criterion. You don't know that Jesus actually said that beforehand. And then you don't know that it actually happened later on. You're just believing the writer. This is a guy writing decades after Jesus died. A guy with a religious agenda. I've said this to other Christians. The evidence of a story does not equal actual evidence. If a prediction in a story comes true, that doesn't mean it actually happened just because the writer claims it did or writes that it did. A liberal minister once said to me, and like me, he does not believe in biblical prophecy either. He said, yeah, well, we could have written it that way too if we wanted to. Manuscript Evidence. You mentioned the numerous manuscripts of the New Testament. And my big point here is that many manuscripts is not evidence of the legitimacy of what they say. It's just evidence of many manuscripts, and that those ideas were popular.
But I think the accounts deserve at least a little bit of respect. We accept what was written about Alexander the Great, about Caesar, about many other historical people.
Well, we agree that Jesus existed. The issue here is not whether Jesus existed, but whether he was resurrected. To say I'm not being consistent if I accept history regarding Caesar, but not history regarding Jesus, is missing the point. It's whether the alleged miracle of the resurrection was real. That part of the story, the miraculous part.
So let's just follow your line of thinking. There are documents saying Caesar existed.
Okay, right.
If Caesar is said to have done something, I believe it. Why? Because they wrote about it.
Okay.
Now, if you don't believe what was recorded about Caesar, then I would understand why you don't believe what was recorded about Jesus.
Oh, you're missing the point. I do believe what was recorded about Caesar and about Jesus, that he lived, that he preached, that he was crucified, but not the miracles, not his rising from the dead. That part I do not believe. There's a critical difference.
But here's the thing, though. If I believe that Caesar was real, because there were documents written about him, using that line of logic, how am I going to dispute what was written about Jesus? There are more writings and original documents from the New Testament than any other historical events or people from that time period. Massively so. It's overwhelming how many more thousands of documents there are. So, if I'm going to believe this about Caesar just because we found a couple bits of evidence, how am I not going to believe this about Jesus when I readily believe that about Caesar? And then you say, I believe that about Caesar, but I don't believe the miracles about Jesus.
Yes, exactly. Because there is a key difference between believing someone existed in history and believing everything said about the person. You're conflating the two. Caesar is a good example, a very good example. I think it's very reasonable to think Caesar existed and did many of the things written about what he did, but not that he was born of a virgin, which is what is also claimed about him. That's just a common myth of that time period. That's not reality. That's not credible. That is not reasonable to believe. Another example, I think it's quite reasonable to think there was in fact a blind poet named Homer, who lived in ancient Greece, who wrote the Odyssey. But I do not think it's reasonable to assume that therefore everything he wrote was true, that therefore a one-eyed giant Cyclops existed. The Egypt Prophecy.
I believe in prophecy. I've seen lots of prophecy.
Like what? What in the Bible is impressive prophecy? I find failed prophecies. Example, here's a simple one, Ezekiel 29:10-11. I will make the land of Egypt an utter waste and desolation. A man's foot will not pass through it, and the foot of a beast shall not pass through it, and it will not be inhabited for 40 years. So Ezekiel predicted Egypt will not have the foot of either man or beast walked through it for 40 years. There's never been a 40-year period of Egyptian history when no foot walked there. That's a failed prophecy.
All right, explain that.
What's to explain? He prophesied that Egypt will be uninhabited for 40 years, but there's never been a 40-year period when it hasn't been inhabited.
I wish I had more time to do research. I'm not helping you much here.
Note that invariably, when I seem to leave out the Christian's response, it's because there was no real response, just irrelevant general talk all around the subject. If a Christian does have a decent response, I pick up on it right away and remember it and include it. When I ask the same question to my 10th Christian, and he or she responds differently from the party line, I always remember it. So like I say, I never unfairly leave stuff out. They just never had a relevant answer. In this case, his response was to question whether it was really Egypt Ezekiel was talking about, and not maybe just one particular town in Egypt. Christians are experts in could-have-been scenarios to get out of contradictions. But here we did go on to further discuss the Egypt prophecy.
You used the word hyperbole at one point. I think it's important to realize that it was very common for the biblical authors to use hyperbole.
But you can't go exaggerating that much. It's dishonest.
But you can't write the rules for their literature.
I can. They have to speak the truth. Those are the rules for any discourse. You have to speak truthfully. You can't exaggerate beyond all bounds. A poem or a story or a joke, okay, but not about such serious matters like the lives, the literal lives of the people of Egypt back then.
There's a literary genre you're not understanding. It's like if someone were to write a poem, and the poem had a lot of metaphors, and I read it literally. They would be like, no, that was a metaphor I wrote, a metaphor.
But this is not a metaphor, this Egypt prophecy.
Well, it is in the example I gave.
But we're talking about the Egypt prophecy here, about Egypt being uninhabited. You're deflecting by bringing up some other case. You're making like a general hypothetical argument which, depending on the case, might be valid. But with Egypt, that is the literal country of Egypt. It's not poetry or symbolic. It's the literal people and country of Egypt.
Yeah, you told me about the Egypt prophecy, and then I looked up that one article and sent it to you.
Where was that article from?
Well, it wasn't actually an article. It was just what someone posted in a forum.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, because I was not impressed. I mean, the guy just makes some general assertions and then just abruptly concludes, so obviously it's a valid prophecy. I looked up stuff on several sites. All right, first of all, here's the prophecy. Ezekiel 29:10-11. I will make the land of Egypt utterly waste and desolate. Neither foot of man shall pass through it, nor foot of beast shall pass through it. It shall be uninhabited 40 years. So the thing that you sent me said there's absolutely no recorded history of anything in that area during that period, after the people were driven out. No recorded history. But no recorded history is not the same thing as no people or animals there at all for 40 years. There may not have been much recorded history there for those decades, but that's not a fulfillment of that prophecy. Then it makes no sense to me to drive people out of a whole country and then just leave. The Nile Valley there, a lot of Egypt is desert, but the Nile Valley is very productive and fertile. And people are not just going to leave, and the animals are not going to leave. They're all going to be there. So this is like a huge overstatement on Ezekiel's part. So that Christian defense you sent me, I don't find valid. The Christian defense that there was apparently no recorded history for 40 years, so therefore the prophecy did come true. No recorded history is not the same thing as no person or animal living there in the whole country. A second Christian defense I found was that it was hyperbole, that Ezekiel was simply overstating it for effect. But my point is, I don't trust people who exaggerate that much. Third Christian defense, quote, given that assertion of people being absent from the land, it suggests the prophecy will have to wait until the end times to be fulfilled. That's not impressive because it hasn't happened yet. As soon as you say, well, it's going to happen in the future, the prophecy loses any impressiveness. Remember, I mentioned that's one of the key criteria of valid prophecy. No open time frame, and you agreed to that.
Right, but an open time frame does not disprove a prophecy if it's still possible to be fulfilled in the future.
Yeah, I suppose so, but you can see why I'm not impressed. Then I found a few more Christian arguments which, are Weasley arguments. Quote, it suggests that Egypt will have no inhabitants for 40 years. The prophecy doesn't suggest it, it flatly states it.
Fair enough.
Another one, only a small remnant survived. A remnant is not no one. Another one, Egypt was left a desolate, sparsely populated wasteland. Sparsely populated is not no one. So these apologists are trying to make it seem like it came true, even though it falls far short of the actual prediction of no foot of man or beast and uninhabited for 40 years. That did not happen. Now, here's citations I found agreeing with me that the Egypt prophecy failed. Quote, we have contemporary records of life continuing much as ever throughout the period, leaving no room for any supposed depopulation. From the Neolithic time to present, Egypt has never been uninhabited. Another one, no 40-year period of such complete desolation of Egypt has been confirmed. Another one, they ignore the fact that there is no historical record of an uninhabited Egypt. And that only makes sense. The Nile Valley is a fertile area, very suitable for people living there. And lastly, was Egypt ever a wasteland? The simple answer is no. Not all of Egypt, ancient or modern, qualifies as a desert. Areas near the Nile River tend to be lusher, and Egyptians in both ancient and modern times have had a thriving system of agriculture. Unquote. So, to me, this Egypt prophecy is a false prophecy, and I can't trust a book that has such a clearly false prophecy. I'll let you ruminate on that. Messianic prophecies.
There are Messianic prophecies that are quite specific, but I don't think they would impress you.
Give me an example.
Psalm 22, the prophecy of Jesus' crucifixion, that the men would divide his clothes and his bones would not be broken.
Okay, so these details are impressive to you? To me, dividing an executed person's clothes was a common thing back then, not a miraculous fulfillment.
You have to understand literary technique also. For example, Psalm 22 talks about dogs surrounding Jesus. Were there literal dogs surrounding Jesus?
No, I get that. I have no problem with that. It's figurative language. But go ahead, keep reading till we get to a problematic verse.
They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothes they cast lots. This is an example that Christians would say is prophetic of Jesus, because they did pierce his hands and feet, because his bones were literally visible, because they whipped him so much, because the soldiers divided his garments among themselves, and they cast lots for his clothing. So all those things happened.
Are claimed to have happened by the storyteller.
You're still rationalizing about this with the preconception that these things didn't happen. You have to at least do the work to understand.
I have done the work. I've looked into all these prophecies. And I find that the New Testament writers just go back to the Old Testament and pull out stuff that matches and say, aha, prophecy fulfilled. But they ignore the stuff that doesn't match. That's what I find. Like the writer of Psalm 22 begs to be rescued, whereas Jesus intended to die, to go to his death. That key element does not match at all. So that's why I'm not impressed.
Okay, I didn't expect you to be impressed.
Incidentally, a favorite Christian argument is that crucifixion was not a normal method of execution until hundreds of years later. Yet Psalm 22 in the Old Testament refers to the person's hands and feet being pierced. Is that not a miraculously specific prediction? I don't think so. The Hebrew word for pierced means mauled, clawed at, or wounded. It does not specifically mean hands and feet pierced by nails. It's just a similarity being picked out of being wounded or mauled. Not to mention that passage is David talking about himself in the past tense. It's not him making a miraculous prediction for the future about Jesus. Christians are just deliberately drawing a connection. The need to know the original language.
I'm also saying you need to study Hebrew.
Oh, I don't think so. That to me is one of the many rationalizations Christians use to claim a passage does not mean what it clearly does mean. Somehow when we read, "the horse was black" in English, I'm supposed to understand that in the original Hebrew it actually meant the horse is white. Knowing the original Hebrew is only important in a very few cases. I don't need to know Hebrew. Expert translators, groups of expert translators, have translated the Hebrew as accurately as they can. Do you think you know Hebrew better than those experts?
Yet you won't believe what these groups of experts have written down.
Right, because the substance of what they wrote down, whether it's actually true, is a very different issue than the proper translation of the material. Their expertise is on the translation of the language, not the validity of the claims made. Not to mention that the translators were invariably Christian, so there's a built-in bias there. You seem to think I'm totally immune to being impressed by prophecy, but that's not true. It could be impressive if it said something impressive. Under the guidelines for valid prophecy I mentioned earlier, known to have been predicted, known to have been fulfilled, and specific, not some vague thing that happens a lot anyway. There's an atheist, Dan Barker. He said about prophecy that if someone predicts a meteorite will hit a specific house on the left side on a specific day, travel down to the basement and lodge itself at the foot of a washing machine, and the meteorite will consist of the following elements and so on, then he'd be impressed. Specificity beyond chance. This is what I say about biblical prophecy after studying it carefully, that it is not miraculous fulfillments. It's just deliberately drawn connections by writers with a religious agenda. It's selective retrofitting. Jesus' end times prophecy. Wasn't Jesus flat wrong about the end of the world coming in his generation? He said, Matthew 24:34, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place."
When he's talking about this generation, he's talking about people on the earth.
You're saying this generation simply means human beings on earth at any time period? But it's not. It's not just any people, it's the people of this generation, his generation. How about the "some standing here" passage, Matthew 16:28? "I say to you that there are some standing here who will not taste death till they see the kingdom of God present with power." He's not talking about people in general, he's talking about these people standing right in front of him and present with power. That didn't happen, Christianity present with power, until probably the 4th century in Constantine.
But it did happen 6 days later with the transfiguration of Jesus Christ, that episode when the apostles saw Jesus in his glory on the mountainside.
Well, to me that is not a kingdom present with power. That's just some apostles having a vision on the mountainside.
They saw Jesus speaking with Moses and Elijah, Jesus glorified. They heard the voice of the Father. That's the power and glory he's talking about. Of course his kingdom was present with power there.
With that little group of apostles.
That's right. When he says some standing here, he's referring to James and John and Peter, the apostles he took with him.
But you can see how this is not convincing to me, that somebody said that this happened to the apostles. It's not verified history. I mean, how do I know this actually happened?
Well, you don't know.
I don't.
But I believe it because it's in the Bible. That is the testimony of the Holy Spirit.
But you're ignoring context. The verse right before the standing here passage talks about the Son of Man coming and, quote, rewarding each according to his works. Rewarding each according to his works. So that has to be Judgment Day, not the Transfiguration. It's the very next verse where Jesus says, some standing here shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So to me, Jesus is clearly referring to Judgment Day, a major worldwide event in the lifetime of the people standing right in front of him, not to his transfiguration in front of a few apostles. I think Jesus thought the world would end back then, and he was flat wrong. And there are soon passages throughout the Bible. The book of Revelation begins with things which must shortly take place. The end of all things is at hand. In these last days, the one who is coming will not delay. The time is short, for the time is near. The time is at hand. I am coming quickly to give everyone according to his work.
The book of Revelation is metaphorical.
Well, metaphorical or not, it says everything is going to happen soon. And it's been 2,000 years and it hasn't happened.
But you have to understand God's broader perspective on time. The Apostle Peter even points that out, that to God 1,000 years is as one day. 2 Peter 3:8. With the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day.
That's just an excuse because it hasn't happened.
No, that's not an excuse. That gives you an idea of how God views time and who is in charge of when it happens. He gets to say when. He gets to define soon.
But he's talking to us human beings. He's not talking to himself. It's really misleading to say to humans, it's going to happen soon, when there's at least 2,000 years to go yet, way beyond the death of the people he's talking to. To me, the whole thing is very dishonest. People making excuses because it didn't happen. The Bethlehem and virgin birth prophecies. I think the Bethlehem and virgin birth prophecies are both clearly false.
Why?
Because, I thought we went through this already. Because the Messiah out of Bethlehem, predicted in Micah, was supposed to be a military leader. Jesus was not a military leader. So that is not a valid prophecy.
Okay.
And then the virgin birth prophecy, that Messiah was supposed to be a sign unto King Ahaz. King Ahaz had been dead for 700 years before Jesus was even born, so Jesus couldn't have been a sign unto King Ahaz. So this to me is also a false prophecy, where New Testament writers just go back to the Old Testament and drag out whatever they want. 3,000 fulfilled prophecies, you said to me. I would like you to give me just one of those, your best one, and I'll explain to you why it is not a valid prophecy. And those are two of the top ones, are they not? The Bethlehem and the virgin birth prophecies? I mean, do you have any better one than those two?
Well, what evidence do you have against the virgin birth?
Well, not the virgin birth, but the virgin birth prophecy.
You just don't think the Old Testament passage is talking about Jesus.
Right, exactly. It's provably not talking about Jesus, because this Messiah was supposed to be a sign unto King Ahaz, and Jesus wasn't even born when Ahaz lived.
This probably won't mean anything to you, but I think that is still a misuse of literary genre, like not understanding how prophecy actually works for the biblical writers.
Well, I think it works because they have ridiculously low standards. It's like anything that matches any element in an Old Testament statement, regardless of context, is claimed as a miraculous fulfillment. I mean, this is what I constantly see, is that with elements that match, you go, oh, wow, look at that. But with elements that don't match, you just ignore that.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable with non-matching elements.
For me, the non-matching elements disprove biblical prophecy. As I've said, I think it's just New Testament writers deliberately and subjectively drawing connections. They're not miraculous fulfillments. Thanks for watching. Please check my website, Confronting Believers, for other issues by which one can decide whether Christianity is true or not.